he was designing for and what kind of singled him out was this idea of designing for a kind of independent woman.
It's fashion that is looking to separates, to clothing that is made of a wide range of materials, not just the usual things that you would expect from couture.
It was focused on cuts, on superb fabrics, on clothes that weren't fussy. His clothes stood for a certain kind of streamlined elegance.
I think that's what we forget now when we look back at Hubert de Givenchy, because it is so perfect, it's so grown up. It was seen as youthful.
Making clothes that, in effect, kind of heralded the launch of designer ready-to-wear in the 1960s. Really what he offered to couture clients specifically was kind of a gentle passage into that new era.
Hubert de Givenchy was born to an aristocratic family in Oise, France on February 21st, 1927.
Hubert de Givenchy was born as a member of the French aristocracy. His father died when he was quite young, and he was raised around his mother and his maternal grandmother.
As with so many aristocrats of the time, there was a real sort of appreciation for luxury, for textiles as part of that, and also a background within his family of textile mills.
The family had a textile company which must have been extremely helpful when wanting to be a designer. So he developed a sort of rather refined taste and knowledge of fabrics early on.
Aged 10, Hubert visited the 1937 World's Fair in Paris and was instantly inspired. This event, in conjunction with his love of textiles, played a large part in a young Givenchy, promptly deciding that his future lay somewhere in fashion design.
It exposed him as kind of a creatively influenced youngster to textiles from all around the world, and really that was the idea of being exposed to something very different to the high French couture of that time.
That connection between commerce and making and manufacturing, and the role of textiles within design was really fundamental from the start for him.
He saw fabrics from all over the world. This made him want to explore more, it made him want to see more of the world, and I think he sniffed freedom from the mother and the grandmother, and Paris, here he came.
When he was 17, he went to the École des Beaux-Arts to pursue a career in fashion design. That was his aim from his earliest upbringing.
When you think what was happening in Paris at that time with the Nazi occupation, that people were still going to college and learning the art of couture is extraordinary. And then his first apprenticeship was with Jacques Fath.
He began an apprenticeship for the designer Jacques Fath, who his family members knew personally. The next 7 years saw him continuing to learn the art of the couturier from Robert Piguet and doing designs for Lucien Lelong.
He worked for Lucien Lelong, so someone who was really important within the Chambre syndicale, and someone who was also really canny in understanding the importance of America, in understanding the importance of consolidating an idea of what your fashion house stands for.
When he worked at Lucien Lelong, he actually worked alongside Christian Dior and Pierre Balmain, who were both designing at the same time, as well as Marc Boin. He would have been exposed to what were some of the largest and best couture ateliers in Paris.
The world still looks to Paris, despite its temporary eclipse during the war, as the historic source of creative fashion, a position it has maintained for centuries.
In the subsequent years, he collaborated with Elsa Schiaparelli. It's very interesting that he worked with Schiaparelli. A lot of people don't know that because her style is very, very flamboyant, theatrical, a lot of surrealism, Dadaism in her work. So maybe he ran in the opposite direction from what Elsa had taught him.
He made a lot of separates for her boutique, and that's something that he then comes on to be really very well known for.
Givenchy made a lasting impression on the Parisian fashion scene. thanks to his remarkably tall frame and uniquely elegant designs based on powerful femininity, he was quite unforgettable. In 1952, after being dismissed by Elsa Schiaparelli, his own design house, the revolutionary La Maison Givenchy, was born.
Christian Dior was 42 by the time he presented his first couture collection. It was really revolutionary to see someone so young founding a couture house.
His first collection got rave reviews, so there was never any problem of acceptance there.
L'Album de Figaro wrote a feature stating that in one night, Hubert de Givenchy became one of fashion's most famous children with his first collection.
They were raving about his young clothes. I think that's what we forget now when we look back at old Givenchy, because it is so perfect, it's so grown up. But it was seen as youthful.
He was a youthful couturier, and he was creating youthful clothes. It was almost a precursor to the sort of couture we see in the 60s with Pierre Cardin and André Courrèges, where there's very much this focus on youth, on a certain dynamism. And really, Givenchy's early designs had that.
His first notably exceptional sartorial pieces were skirts and tailored blouses made from raw cotton.
There was a movement amongst the bourgeoisie in the 50s for these rather sort of understated, quite simple, almost peasant clothes. Of course, they were very, very refined, so there would be silks that looked like linens and so on. He made this collection from cottons, and it went down a storm.
He's really interested in quite mundane fabrics like cotton, denim, leather, fabrics that perhaps wouldn't be so immediately associated with couture, but he's able to use them in such a way that they become a sort of refined and exquisite element within a design.
Givenchy designed separates, which was seen as something revolutionary. For a couturier to propose a skirt and blouse to women rather than a complete look was really seen as something quite extraordinary.
This seemed very fresh and new, and very practical as well.
Using these fabrics in a very, very feminine way. He's taking a traditionally male fabric and using it in a very feminine light. So there's a sort of youthfulness and kind of almost dewiness, I think, to his designs, that they're really, really fresh.
Named after his muse and model of the day, Bettina Graziani, Givenchy created the Bettina blouse.
It was cotton, it had a sort of wide open neck, and it featured English embroidery on it.
His Bettina blouse, which was kind of a ruffled and flounced number, was made out of cotton piqué, which wasn't the sort of fabric that people were used to couturiers using.
I think that's really quintessentially Givenchy, that it adds quite sharp tailoring, a knowledge of how tailoring pulls into the body, but then very sort of frivolous seeming feminine elements, which are then balanced with the more masculine elements of the shirt front and the fabric.
In 1953, Givenchy met Audrey Hepburn. It was to be the start of a lifelong relationship, and through the global reach of Hollywood, it allowed Givenchy's designs to be showcased around the world.
I think it's a really interesting story how he meets Audrey Hepburn, that she is actually, it's via a Schiaparelli contact that she is brought to his house, and it's when she is looking for costumes for Sabrina.
Well, hello, how are you?
When Audrey Hepburn first met Hubert de Givenchy, he was incredibly disappointed because he actually thought it was going to be Katharine Hepburn that he was going to be dressing. And then this kind of little waif turned up.
But I think when she arrived in a little sort of shirt just knotted at the waist, and I think little capri pants and ballet shoes, I mean, he could just see that this was an actress who had absolute innate style.
Oh, you look lovely, Sabrina.
He sort of describes her as coming in and having quite a sort of eclectic, eccentric style, but incredibly charming within that. And I think it's that kind of meeting of someone, in Audrey Hepburn's case, who was fascinated by clothing but had not yet found her oeuvre, if you like. She hadn't quite found the design that spoke of her body, that spoke of her idea of femininity.
Kiss me, David.
Love to, Sabrina.
He dressed her for Sabrina to great acclaim, and also found that she had a genuine love for fashion. She was born in Belgium, so they had kind of an affinity in terms of that European upbringing.
Givenchy's big breakthrough was Breakfast at Tiffany's, and arguably that's his most famous contribution, and his most famous dress is the one that Hepburn wears when she's sort of having an early breakfast outside the Tiffany shop in New York.
It's interesting that his dress was used in Breakfast at Tiffany's because obviously Holly Golightly was seen as this kind of free-spirited, kind of modern woman, rather than the sort of corseted and corseted women that were represented by Christian Dior's new look.
Even people who've never seen the film know the poster. I mean, it's one of the most famous artifacts of the 20th century, the poster of Audrey Hepburn with the cigarette holder and the little black dress. And that little black dress still looks pretty modern today.
The dress is a column dress. It's more sophisticated, it's a more grown-up idea of evening wear.
After that, she had it written into her contract that I am dressed by Hubert, and it's rather a smart thing to have done.
The fact that he continually dressed her throughout all of her films, they stand as kind of archetypes for what people understood as Givenchy's style, which was a style that was very spare, that was focused on cuts, on superb fabrics, on clothes that weren't fussy. I think that's really what his clothes stood for, a certain kind of streamlined elegance.
He did 8 films with Audrey altogether, right up till 1979, I think. So that was an incredibly fruitful meeting that he had that day with Audrey, and it really influenced the way he designed.
She just looked so joyful and so just filled with happiness when she put on his clothes, and I think that's what you see radiating from her when she wears her designs, and what makes them so appealing and really brings them to life and really unites the two of them.
She was the dream muse for any designer, but particularly brought out the best in Hubert, and he was a very charming man as well. And I think Chanel could have dressed Audrey Hepburn, but I think the relationship might not have been as enduring. I think it would have been much more prickly.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
At the age of 25, Hubert de Givenchy was the youngest designer in the developing Parisian fashion scene. He had become very famous in a short space of time. Givenchy's credibility expanded when he met Cristobal Balenciaga. That same year, one of Givenchy's designs was on the cover of Life magazine.
What happened really is that Balenciaga became a mentor for Givenchy.
The way that Balenciaga would remove restrictions from clothes, you know, he didn't want to upholster women the way that Dior has been accused of doing. I think really that translated into Hubert de Givenchy's designs, but with less grandeur, with less drama, something that was more realistic, something that was more everyday almost.
And so what you see is more classical line to a line that's more architectural and more considered. And, you know, he even moves his couture house so that he's opposite Balenciaga. So there's sort of physical proximity as well as sort of intellectual and creative proximity between the two of them.
Givenchy and Balenciaga collaborated in 1957 to create a new silhouette called the sac, a loose dress lacking a defined waistline.
Designs which become so famous, like the sack-back dress, which is an interesting modernist rethinking of an 18th century style that puts weight onto the back of a dress so it sort of flows down from the shoulders.
It was extremely elegant and very hard to do well. And it was very, very fresh because, you know, we'd had all this focus on the waist and the buffy big skirts.
I can't really think of another example where you have designers, couturiers, working so closely together and being so explicit about it and not being kind of egotistical and saying, having to claim it for themselves, but that it's something that's come out of talking together, working together in a shared aesthetic.
Originally created exclusively for Audrey Hepburn, Givenchy released his perfume L'Interdit in 1957. It was the first time the world had ever seen the face of a celebrity on a perfume.
There had been kind of Elsa Schiaparelli Shocking, which was linked abstractly to Mae West. But L'Interdit was the first time that a celebrity had openly endorsed a couturier's perfume.
It was really significant in that it had so much deeper resonance because of their existing relationship.
He'd made it specially for her originally, which is, I think, such a lovely thing. I mean, so often now when designers launch perfumes, they've just gone to Procter & Gamble and sort of taken something off the shelf. The fact that this man had developed this perfume for one woman is really quite magical.
With somebody like Audrey Hepburn, when she's tied so intrinsically to a house like Givenchy, it really takes that kind of celebrity endorsement to another level.
As Givenchy's designs receive huge international success, America's First Lady, Jacqueline Kennedy, caused a stir by wearing a Givenchy evening dress during a visit to Paris in 1961.
It caused a bit of a fuss back in America because First Ladies were meant to wear American designers, and she got wrapped on the knuckles.
Givenchy, with this Hollywood connection, was kind of a French style that Americans could relate to. It was a French name that Americans could relate to.
She did look very regal in it. And I think that contributed to the whole aristocratic clothes horse view of Jackie that was incredibly seductive to many people, but also alienating to some.
Throughout the 1960s, fashion changed and the ready-to-wear market boomed. Givenchy retained much appeal, particularly with women of the aristocracy such as Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor and the Princess Grace.
Givenchy had that kind of confidence of aristocracy, that assurance of knowing his position in society.
And I think what drew them to Givenchy was that his clothing was always very proper, that it was very beautifully designed and made, it was flattering, it was wearable, it was drawing attention to the woman for the right reasons.
I think the interesting thing with Wallis Windsor wearing Givenchy to the Duke of Windsor's funeral is really to see that in the continuum of her style. She was said to be the most elegant woman alive, and the fact that she chose Givenchy for such a pivotal moment is incredibly important. It's a real stamp of what he stood for at that point in French fashion, which I think was a stand for tradition, but not necessarily a stand for staidness.
As mainstream consumer needs continue to move away from haute couture and into ready-to-wear, fashion houses across the world saw a sudden change in demand.
There was one season, basically, when department stores just stopped buying haute couture and started to buy ready-to-wear. Why would you license haute couture and have copies made at your own expense when you could just buy the designer ready-to-wear and it was already made for you? So really, it pricked the bubble, it all collapsed. Yves Saint Laurent said that couture was dead in 1971. The whole world sort of changed. I think Givenchy was probably quite scared by that.
In 1973, his first men's ready-to-wear line was established. Throughout the 70s and 80s, the Givenchy brand expanded worldwide into many different areas with much success. His Lincoln Mark V car design in the 1970s sold out immediately.
Why do you sleep so still?
For a lot of the older couture clients, as people like Dior died, as Balenciaga closed his house, as the houses that they'd always gone to, they all flocked to Givenchy because they knew that he would dress them in a manner that wasn't controversial, that wasn't aggressive, that wasn't going to kind of shock their friends or husbands.
As the years progressed, Givenchy continued to thrive in an ever-changing world of fashion.
In 1983, Vivienne Westwood showed her collection in Paris, and newspaper reporters said that you had to miss Givenchy to see it, but it was worth it. And really that kind of sets the pace for Givenchy, who was continuing in a very quiet way, but certainly not reacting to kind of the new landscape of fashion.
In 1988, Givenchy decided to sell his fashion house to the LVMH group.
I think he was coming to the end of his career. He was increasingly out of sync with contemporary fashions. And it was a period when big luxury brands like LVMH were looking to buy older established couture houses and reimagine them for the late 20th century.
In the 1980s and early 90s, LVMH was building up a portfolio of brands and was really seen as somebody that was resurrecting French haute couture.
I imagine that they made him an offer he couldn't refuse and that he was getting on a bit and he didn't have an obvious heir.
I think it was the continuation of his name. They were really seen as kind of saviours of French fashion. I think what Givenchy hoped to do by selling his house to LVMH was to secure its future.
Givenchy continued to design for the house until 1995, when he would present his ultimate collection.
It then went through quite a sort of rapid succession of designers. John Galliano was there prior to going to Dior. McQueen was there quite unhappily for a brief spell. Julian MacDonald was there for a brief spell.
The onus there was really on ready-to-wear and on making something that had an impact at ready-to-wear and an impact at haute couture. It wasn't so much about dressing people anymore, it was about creating these images that would sell Givenchy perfume, that would sell Givenchy makeup and would also sell accessories.
And then Riccardo Tisci took over, and really what he has done is rethink what Givenchy stands for, but still very much focusing on youth.
He's got great friendship with Kanye West and Kim Kardashian. They have been at a lot of his shows, they wear the clothes, Rihanna wears the clothes. It's become very sexy.
There's a sense of sort of youthfulness and being inspired by street culture, subculture. So it's a very different kind of Givenchy, but staying true to some of its original ideals.
It's a new way of looking at houses and looking at existing fashion houses in the 21st century. Is this idea of going in, taking the name and then doing whatever you want underneath it. And I really think that's why Givenchy is successful now. It's because of Riccardo Tisci, because of people reacting to his aesthetic rather than necessarily reacting to the name Givenchy or the legacy of the house.
The Givenchy brand continues to be a world leader in the global fashion industry. Throughout his career, Hubert de Givenchy was nominated for an Academy Award for Funny Face, featured on the International Best Dress list, and received a Lifetime Achievement Award. There have been exhibitions of his work around the world, and he has been an inspiration to many designers.
In the 60 years since Hubert de Givenchy set up his house, his work has been in countless exhibitions. People see it all the time without necessarily knowing that they're looking at Givenchy.
I think really what Hubert de Givenchy will be remembered for is actually a very brief but very tumultuous period in French haute couture. It's that move from the 50s into the 60s. It's that move from people wanting to dress like their mothers into mothers wanting to dress like their daughters.
I think he's someone who had a very successful house, a very successful career. I think he was very good at disseminating and publicising his look through collaboration with Hepburn and other stars.
I think his clothes are timeless, and I think the femininity and the elegance that he espoused and did so beautifully. Even now, if you ask most women how they want to dress, it isn't even necessarily fashionably, they just want to look elegant. They would love that, wouldn't we all? And I think that's what Givenchy did for women.